Welcome to Let's Talk Justice. I am Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice, and I am normally joined by Michael Jackson, Executive Director at Jamaicans for Justice. She's running a bit late today, so I will start out the show and hopefully she will join us soon. Our substantive topic for today focuses on the EU Samoa Agreement, which we have delayed in our signing of as a nation. So we're going to be joined by Glenroy Murray, Executive Director at Equality for All Foundation, and human rights advocate Carol Narcisse to discuss some of the intricacies of that agreement later on in the show. But before we do so, of course, we will start out with our recap of our human rights issues over the past week or so. And while these may not be completely human rights focused, they are certainly some current affairs issues that we think we should bring some attention to. And I'm sure when Mikkel joins us, she'll have some more to add to what I have to say. But we'll start out with a story I saw last week in the Gleno covering the court reporters and the issues that they have been having with their ability to do their work. And it's one of the things that we would have identified at Jamaicans for Justice as an issue regarding access to justice, where persons are waiting on, for example, the transcript from their trial to be able to do an appeal, and the length of time that they've waited for that transcript have in the past led to the case being dismissed against them and their appeal being automatically granted because of that length of time that they've been waiting. And the reporters are calling out, saying that one, they are extremely short-staffed. There are supposed to be 45 reporters. There are only 24 currently on staff out of that 45. Not to mention they are dissatisfied with the level of compensation that they have been receiving for the work that they do. So hopefully those persons who are part of the Court Administration Division and the Ministry of Justice are hearing these issues from the court reporters and are working towards some policy solutions to respond to that. Also happening last week was that little, well, not little, we had a severe weather system pass over the country, and between Thursday night and Friday we received some heavy rains that have affected several parts of the country to a serious extent. I know some persons were stranded in St. Thomas, I think it was, and had to be rescued via helicopter. You know, it really highlights, coming off the back of the earthquake, it really highlights that we need to be putting in place our disaster preparedment facilities must be in better condition. Our draining systems seem to be in terrible condition because we had flooding over several places. Several roads were inaccessible. So hopefully we're taking note of these issues, because we're going into issues of climate departure now as a nation. We need to take stock of what our weather systems are doing and act accordingly. Now, on a lighter note, we can talk about yesterday being World Children's Day under the theme For Every Child, Every Right. And while we celebrate Child's Month in Jamaica in May, World Children's Day is celebrated internationally and was commemorated by our major institutions yesterday. And in addition to that, we will have several important days coming up, including this Saturday being International Day Against the Elimination of Violence Against Women. That is the 25th of November and marks the beginning of what is the 16 days of activism. So you'll be hearing a lot from us and several of our partners over that period of time. Now, there's one other thing I want to talk about, but I will leave it to the end of the show in our final segment. So we'll go now straight to our right of the day. And our right of the day for today comes from the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, Section 13 of your Constitution, 3B, which states that we all have that right to freedom of thought, conscience, belief, and observance of political doctrine. However, in our constitution, it should be noted that all our rights are limited to the extent that they do not prejudice the rights and freedoms of others. So you have your rights as long as it is not being enacted in such a way to prejudice the rights of others. And our trivia question for today, in keeping with our topic, is what is the name of the agreement that precedes the Samoa Agreement? So we're going to be discussing the EU Samoa Agreement today, and there is an agreement that preceded this one. What is the name of that agreement? To participate in our trivia, you can send us a WhatsApp at 876-239-7583, or you can send us a message on our Instagram pages at Jamaicans for Justice. So our substantive topic for today: why not sign? Interrogating the issues around the EU Samoa Agreement. Now, recently, our government would have delayed its signing of the Samoa Agreement, which is the agreement to replace the previous 10-year agreement. I purposefully did not include the name, as that is a part of our trivia today. But the delay is due to concerns raised by the Christian lobby group, the Jamaica Coalition for a Healthy Society. And their concern is that the agreement is outside of the usual scope of international agreements, that it binds Jamaica to vague human rights obligations, and that it will force the reintroduction of comprehensive sexuality education in schools, which they find to be a perverse curriculum. That it has the potential to involve Jamaica in unspecified international instruments and threatens the rights of Jamaican citizens to freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. Now, in response to these concerns, 15 civil society groups as well as 21 individuals, including Jamaicans for Justice, would have responded in an open call to the government. And their argument was that the agreement's scope was not unprecedented at all, as similar subject areas had been covered in the articles of the previous agreement, which was in place for 2000 to 2020 and extended into 2021. Furthermore, that the concerns about the absence of a definition of human rights is immaterial, as the text would align with all other existing international declarations and agreements that speak to the same issue. So that group of persons would have called on the government to sign the agreement and emphasized that it is in continuity with the agreement that was in place for the previous 21 years. Now, the government would have said it is taking concerns into consideration and will be doing some stakeholder engagement and consultation, and therefore that is the reason for the delay. So we're going to be unpacking some of these concerns and some of these issues, and also some of the arguments in response to these issues. And to do so, I am joined in studio by Glenroy Murray, the Executive Director of Equality for All Foundation. And am I joined by Miss Carol Narcisse? No, so she will join us shortly. So, as we wait on Glenroy to get set up in the studio, I have to wonder, and these are some of the things I'm going to ask Glenroy to first discuss with our listeners. What exactly is this agreement that we are all so concerned about? What does it affect? What is the general scope of it? If you could give us that response. And I'm looking to my producer now. Yes, you can.
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me on the program. It's interesting because, this agreement has been talked about in certain corners for years and, months. And I don't necessarily think a lot of us have paid a lot of attention to it because it's standard fare. So what this agreement really is is it's a partnership arrangement between EU, the European Union on one hand, and ACP countries, that's the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And what it is an agreement that allows for the EU to provide developmental assistance to these countries within a particular framework. And as you have rightly acknowledged, that this is not new. They had this agreement for the last 20 years, and they had extended it before, and it provide the framework for a lot of the work that the EU has done here in Jamaica. And in other countries, and this is not necessarily to tout, the EU's horn or anything, but a lot of the improvements that we've seen in the justice sector, for example, recently we've heard that the backlog has been cleared. I don't know the extent to which all of that is tied to that, resource development that they've been doing, but we've seen it. The justice sector reform task force had a lot of recommendations. The EU was very invested in strengthening our institutions, and now we're beginning to reap the benefits of that partnership. And so I see this agreement as a continuation of the EU's long-standing commitment to work with developing countries in different parts of the world to I'm trying to figure out the proper terms, really, to kind of do that reparations work almost.
Yes.
Sort of, but not really, to help these countries get to an even playing field within the global space.
Okay, so based on that description of what the agreement is, I am a little bit confused about where the concerns are coming from. What if you could illustrate what exactly in the text was so concerning?
Well, so, there were several concerns raised by the particular groups, and they were saying there were a lot of human rights, quote-unquote, obligations within them. And the truth is, there weren't any extensive human rights obligations.
What were some of the obligations?
So some of those obligations was really just about commitments to addressing human rights of persons in general. So it's about making sure access to justice is a thing, making sure your healthcare services are accessible, making sure your national security systems are accessible, making sure you have free media. So there were all different types of human rights obligations that were in the agreement. And one of those obligations within the agreement, and also it's a very long document, so I can understand people not being familiar with it. So when you look at like the different protocols, because within the agreement there are regional protocols, because it's the ACP, but each region has its own sets of arrangements. Right. So when you look at the Caribbean protocol, there's a section that asks that both parties, which is the EU and the Caribbean countries, to stress the need for universal access to sexual and reproductive health information. It's not an obligation in the truest sense, in terms of, because we signed this agreement, this means that we have to now provide sexual health education in a particular way in our schools. It just says we're committing to recognizing that this is an important thing that as a government we must do here in the Caribbean. We must provide access to this information and service. And the important thing is that it's not different from anything else that we've signed on to. We have signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We've signed on to the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We've signed on to the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And when you look at all of these international human rights frameworks, altogether, they say the exact same thing that this new ACP EU agreement is saying, but in much stronger language. So what we're not recognizing is that every 4 or 5 years, we as a country have to report to different UN treaty bodies. We have to report to other nations in the UN system through the Universal Periodic Review and say how well we're doing with human rights recommendations and human rights obligations. So we're already as a country in a position where we have to say, are we doing enough to provide sexual health information to young people and to adolescents and so on? This agreement just says the EU wants us to continue on that path and want to fund us.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great breakdown of what the issues are. I know that Carol just joined us, but we're going to take the break, and when we come back, we'll pick up with her. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Today we are breaking down some of the issues around the signing of the EU Samoa Agreement, and we are joined by Glenroy Murray, Executive Director at Equality for All Foundation, and Carol Narcisse, who is a human rights advocate and one of the individuals who penned that letter to the government. Carol, are you on with us now?
I am, yes.
Thank you so much for joining. So earlier, Glenroy gave us a good breakdown of what the Samoa Agreement is and what some of the issues that have been raised. And one of them in particular that stood out was a reservation of implementation of the Comprehensive Sexuality Education in schools. And I wanted to ask you if you have any recollection of what is the historical issue with this curriculum, firstly. And then secondly, is this really something that we need to be worried about in context of the agreement?
Well, we've had a long-standing discussion going on in Jamaica about how much should schools tell children in relation to health and family life education. What should, quote-unquote, sex education that's in the curriculum as part of the health and family life education, what should it involve? How much should young people be told? How much of their questions should we be answering, and how do we answer it? And so the health and family life education curriculum has undergone several rounds of review and attempts at revision. In 2012, there was the discussion sort of got very heated because that round of revision of the health and family life education curriculum included topics that especially some church groups had a great difficulty with, right? Because some professionals are of the view that if young people are struggling around issues of let's say, gender identity, right? Who am I? I don't feel as if I embody the body I have been born into, right? It just feels weird to me. I don't feel like my head not feel like this. Where does that young person go? To whom does that young person speak? And how prepared, if it's a teacher that young person is going to talk to, how prepared is that teacher to interact, or how prepared is that guidance counselor to interact with that child, right? The curriculum spoke to things like family and the fact that families no longer husband, wife, and 2 children, that family forms are very varied. In Jamaica, it can be grandmother alone and children. It can be 2. A range of issues were brought into the curriculum.
Yes.
Some groups, some faith groups had huge difficulty with those things being in the curriculum, and so there was a big blow up and those were taken out. Now, comprehensive sexuality education is a very broad set of topics that can go into that curriculum. And the idea is that it is trying to help young people to understand themselves as a human being and the way their bodies change, the feelings they have for other people, how to handle those feelings in a healthy way, a whole range of topics, right? If you're being approached by someone in relationship, let's say you're a high school student, you have a little boyfriend and them beating you, what you must do? Stay in the relationship. So we talk about domestic violence, all sorts of topics are covered. There are many who believe that the curriculum must not it mustn't cover those things, because what you're doing is sexualizing, quote unquote, sexualizing young people. By that, they mean that you are kind of trying to groom them into sexual behaviors. The main thing that is the concern is that it is sexualizing young people into issues of gender identity and the notion that is really only male and female, so don't talk about nothing else, right?
Yes.
Or it's sexualizing them into homosexuality. Why people would think that, I don't know, but they do think that. So these are the issues. Now, the context that these debates are happening is a context in which Jamaica has one of the highest rates of early sexual initiation for children. The age at which they start having sex is very young, one of the youngest in the Latin American and Caribbean region, right? So by the time our children are 12 and thereabouts, many of them are having sex. What should we be talking with those children about? We also have one of the highest rates of early pregnancy and parenthood. How should we be helping those youngsters? So this agreement with the EU recognizes, tries to identify with countries the issues that they are grappling with, and places those issues within an agreement that says this is an issue of great concern for Jamaica. All right, let's put it in there, because that then allows the EU to fund programs in those areas, right? So if economic issues are of concern, it's in there. Human rights is an issue that we're evolving and developing, so that is in there. Environment and climate change is an issue of concern, and so that is in there. And so it covers a range of topics, and that then allows for there to be a framework in which development assistance from the EU can be channeled.
So my question would be, is there any prescriptive aspects to the agreement that gives any specific instructions or action items, or is it simply a call of recognition of the issue and a commitment to addressing it? Or yes, so if you could elaborate for me.
Right, so the question is this an agreement that forces a government to do anything? Or is it an agreement that sets out the framework for the collaboration and cooperation? If a government chooses to do X or Y, however they and their people and their citizens decide they want to do it. So let's say, for example, that Jamaica decides that it's going to set up a single human rights entity. That will be an entity to which people can report human rights breaches, and it has, let's say, a quasi-judicial part to it, just like how the Integrity Commission has a part to it that has an investigator, and it has a semi-prosecutorial function.
Yes.
Right. So suppose we decided we wanted to do that for human rights. That would be a Jamaica decision. So there is nothing in the agreement that makes it what is understood to be coercive, meaning it is used to force you to do this or that. It's an agreement that both parties come to, and the details of that agreement are then up to each country to determine. So the details of how you're going to do human rights stuff, the details of your climate change, your national climate change program, your details of your agricultural whatever is the area, the details are up to the country. as long as it fits in the thematic areas of the Samoa Agreement, then it means that you are able to access, you are able to apply for funding under this agreement for the things you decide to do.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarity, because I think one of the issues that are affecting the conversations that people are trying to have is an understanding that this is some kind of prescriptive thing, and once we sign on to it, there are some obligations that we must implement in a certain way,
Right.
because there seems to be some concern of effect on culture and
Right.
freedom
So
of
I don't know
conscience
if
and freedom of expression.
right.
And,
I
you
don't know
know,
if before I came on if Glenroy spoke to it, but I think it's important for listeners to know that we have been signing agreements with the European bloc of
yes,
community from 1957 till now.
yes,
Okay,
yes,
our long time remember, so we were a colony one time, right? And so back in those days of being colonies, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries from 1957 had were party to the what was then the European Economic Communities. They created the European Development Fund back in 1957, and that's the fund that supported then colonies in their development efforts. And then since most of the countries have become independent, etc., they've continued to sign periodic agreements with what has now become the European Union. So there was one in 1975, there was one in several between 75 and 2000, then one in 2000 that lasted till 2020, and then it got extended to 2021.
So
So
we've
this
been,
new one,
long
this
history.
new long history, and no, I would pay anybody any amount of money I can find if they can tell me one law in Jamaica that we have been forced to change that didn't come about because Jamaicans either advocated for it or the Jamaican government saw it as necessary to do in this time. Since then.
Thank you so much, Carol. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I just want to discuss with you both what effect could us not signing this agreement have on our development, on our citizens, and our sustainable goals. So we'll take the break and we'll be back to discuss that. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We've been discussing the issues surrounding Jamaica's signing of the EU Samoa Agreement, and we've had some really good discussions so far. We've broken down what the agreement is about, and we've also broken down some of the challenges and some of the responses to those challenges. But there's one aspect that I definitely wanted to touch on before we close out this interview segment of the show. And I wanted to ask you, Glenroy, you mentioned a lot of programs and benefits that we would have had due to funding coming from the EU under previous agreements. What, if any, effect could this delay have? I know that several of the other countries who would have been party to it have already signed. So does this prevent us from signing in future? Can we still join? And if we can't, what effect would that have on us?
So I know we can still sign in the future. The timeline for that, I'm not 100% clear on, to be honest. But the delay is that this is a framework for development assistance. And so unless we have a framework in place, the likelihood of us getting the level of support that we've gotten over the last, what would it be, Carol, 60, 70 years,
Yes.
Would not necessarily be there. And so we really have to think about, are we allowing noise to distract us from all that this agreement opens us up to as a country? And when I say all, I mean the support for all our industries, because there's been a focus in the media and in the discussions to look at the human rights provisions and the sexual health related issues. But this that's one small section of, as I said, over 190 pages in an agreement that looks at development in a range of different areas. And I really have to wonder, is our government prepared to say that we won't be accepting this assistance that we've used for years to improve and develop this country because of an agreement that they ought to know doesn't have the impact that certain groups are saying that it has? Because if it had that impact, we would have seen some of these benefits already, or these laws that these church groups are claiming that are being forced upon us. We would have seen it already. Our HFLE curriculum currently does not meet the standard for comprehensive sexuality education,
Yes.
but we already had an agreement in place that is very similar to this one. And so the question is, if we're not there already, what new is this agreement going to add? And the answer is not much in terms of our laws, but what new it can add is a continuation of that developmental assistance that we've been benefiting from. And so my final thing is, who is our government talking to on these matters of, bilateral and multilateral agreements around developmental assistance? Are they only talking to the groups that make the most noise? Who are they engaging and consulting so that they can get a full picture of what we might potentially lose out? Just because somebody somewhere says, oh, I don't think we should go this direction because it may lead to something that we don't like.
Okay, yeah, I have to agree with you there. And I know that in the letter that you sent, and maybe Carol can answer this one. Did you get a response from the government when you sent it? I love you, Carol. If you're still with us.
Yes.
Yes. So I know you sent. We all signed on to it, as well as
Yes.
21 other individuals. Did you get a response from the government on it?
Not at all. So the document was emailed to both to Minister Terrelong as Minister of State, and to the assistant to the minister for the minister's attention, obviously, and that was a week ago or so. There has not been a response. So how does one read that? I know there are other groups, that women's organizations, that collectively have written asking for a meeting, because bear in mind, in the previous agreement, what's known as the Cotonou Agreement, which was signed in 2000 and which went for 21 years, that was the first agreement that recognized the role and importance of civil society, non-government organizations, the private sector, trade unions, local government authorities. So that was the first time an EU ACP agreement recognized those groups as being important in the decision-making process and beneficiaries, groupings to benefit under the agreement. Right? In preparation for that agreement, 20 years ago, the government at the time established a standing forum. We met once a month, I think it was, or some frequency like that. It had private sector on it, NGOs of every description that you could think of, etc., etc. Because the government understood it couldn't be negotiating if it wasn't talking to those groups to understand what are the priorities as you see them to go into this document. It is as a consequence of that agreement that funding has been made available outside of what is available to the government directly, right? Because the EU historically contributed to government's programs and projects.
Yes.
Come the 2000 agreement, it included funding now that was available to other groups. So private sector has been able to apply directly when they put out a call for proposals. NGOs of all sorts, human rights organizations, environment groups, a whole range, have been able to apply for funding when they put out a call for proposals, and so on and so forth.
You know,
So
I heard Gunroy asking the question, and I want to know if you have any information at all on whether a similar consultative process was undertaken for this signing.
no, not at all. Nothing that we are aware of, except that we have heard the Coalition for a Healthy Society saying that they haven't been engaging with the government since 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So the government has been talking to one grouping, but all the other groupings have not, as far as we know, have not been at the table. And subsequent to our writing, we have not heard anything further. But to just answer your question about what's at stake here, there are two things at stake. One is Jamaica's trustworthiness as a negotiating partner in the international arena.
Mm-hmm.
When remember, this process is a 3-year process of negotiation that the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries have just completed with the EU. 3 years. Huh?
Yes.
In which they could take out language, put in language, quarrel over language, say, no, we're not going to sign it if it said that, get that out, put in a full stop. They've had 3 years of that opportunity, which Jamaica has always played a leading role in.
Mm-hmm.
So if your partners cannot trust that at the end of that long wrangling, right, you're not going to come and scuttle the process because one group in your country raises an issue that is not even an issue in the document, right?
Yeah.
Raises a concern that is not borne out by what is in the document. It makes our trustworthiness, our word, be problematic in the international space. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, of course, is the direct financial support and technical support, because it's not just money, right? It's also technical assistance of all sorts. People need to know that the European Union has, for the last, at least the last 20 years on the Cotonou, if not before, but certainly in the last 20 years, not only funded individual projects, they have also put money directly into Jamaica's consolidated fund. They call it budget support, right? Mm-hmm. That means that they put money into your general budget. So when Minister of Finance come up Parliament, come read budget, and him says money ever come to pay for this from here, so here, so here, so here. So remember, me tell you, that some of that money for the last 20 years has come from the EU's direct budget support to Jamaica.
And no law that is objectionable has been changed with that, which is critical to point out that with all the support that they've been giving over the past 20 years, we've not seen any earth-shattering laws change that the government themselves weren't in support of. And so this narrative that this current administration has allowed certain groups to run with and to allow them to stall an important process is concerning at the very least.
Yes.
Yep.
And so in addition to budget support, it has supported road repairs, their funding. Their funding has supported equipment to police and improving the capacity of our police force. It has supported the agricultural sector. It has supported the justice reform process that we have been undergoing for the last at least 15, 20 years, right? Yes. Improving our court systems and all sorts of things. So these are big development concerns that the country has had, that it has had support for.
You know, I certainly hope that we can get an update soon on the inquiries that you have made. Firstly, on the consultation process, because being told that the delay is continuing due to that consultative process that we are unaware of who is being consulted with and when and what that timeline is. As you've both acknowledged, is extremely concerning for such an important process that has supported so many major aspects of our development and our sustained operation as a nation. So hopefully we'll get those kinds of responses soon, but we will continue in our advocacy, I'm sure, to hold some accountability as best as we can to get that response. But we are up on our break. I want to thank you
And I
both.
actually have to leave you.
Okay, well, so I guess we are timely. So I thank you both so
Yes.
much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem. And thank you, Glenroy, for coming in studio to speak with us today. So we're going to take the break, and when we come back, we'll go into our final segment of the show, respond to our trivia questions, and so on. So we'll be back. Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We are in the final segment of the show, and we've just had a very informative and useful conversation on the Samoa Agreement with the EU, and we were joined by Glenroy Murray and Carol Narcisse. And I hope those of you who have or want to form an opinion on this issue will go back and listen to some of these arguments so that we can be informed in our opinion on these issues. But you know, it brought up something that JFJ hopes will continue to be on the forefront of our partners in advocacy agenda going into 2024, and that is comprehensive sexuality education. As our guests rightfully pointed out, our current HFLE curriculum does not fulsomely cover all of the issues that we would want to see covered in a curriculum of that nature. And while we can acknowledge the reservations of persons due to their conservative mindset, we have to also look at the landscape that we are in. As Carol pointed out, we have some of the earliest ages of sexual debut. We're looking at a country, last week our episode was on the increasing number of incest cases in Trelawney. We are looking at high rates of sexual related incidents between minors, whether that is simply early sex or actual sexual assault committed by minors, and we've seen an increasing number of headlines in that arena. So, you know, we have to look at all of the aspects of our cultural situation when we're considering what our children need to know. And as we talk about the innocence of our children, it can't be the same children that we're planning to give our 20-year minimums to in in the parliament. So I think acknowledging that a child has that level of maturity has to extend to other aspects that would be more beneficial to those children. So hopefully we can see increased advocacy around this, but also an increased interest from our political sphere, from our parliament, to see this implementation from the Ministry of Education and so on. Now, one of the other issues that I wanted to talk about at the beginning of the show that I didn't touch on was on the issue of body cameras. Now, 2 weeks ago, we would have had Hugh Faulkner, the commissioner at the INDICOM, Independent Commission of Investigations, speaking about their report, and that report would have found a lack of usage of body cameras amongst officers in both the JCF and JDF. And JFJ would have done its own research in this area as well, and we would have found similarly to INDICOM that there is a lack of implementation. Now, at that time, Mr. Faulkner made clear that it is something that should be a priority, and that is JFJ's position as well. We do believe that it is important to improve policing, and not only would it improve the quality of our policing, but it would also improve the quality of our investigations. There is evidence that can be easily captured if a body cam was involved in many cases that we are currently stuck in because we don't have that kind of evidence. Now, one thing that came up of concern Thursday of last week, Minister of National Security Horace Chang would have said that that is not a major priority for our security forces at this time. Now, what's concerning about that is that we know that we have cameras. Cameras have been donated to us. Cameras have been bought. So we know that we have them, and all we are asking for is the implementation. Now, we think that this must be a priority considering our current state of national security. We are constantly trying to find new and innovative ways to improve our crime rate, and we do believe that this is one of the ways that that can be done. So we hope that Minister Chang will heed to the calls of Indicom, who have been working extensively in the area, who have been covering issues of citizen and security force clashes, where this evidence would have been instrumental, not only to assist the citizen, but in many cases to assist the officer to show that he acted within the course of his duty. So we hope that opinions on this will change. This must be a priority going forward. And we will certainly continue our advocacy in the area to make it a priority. Now, I'm just going to give us our trivia question response for today. And the trivia question was, what was the name of the agreement that preceded the Samoa Agreement that we discussed today? And the name of the agreement, as Carol would have said during the show, so hopefully someone was listening, was the Cotonou Partnership Agreement. And someone was listening because we do have a winner for our trivia on Instagram. It's Kimmy is the winner, and we will respond to you via DM with your prize. My producer is constantly on the plug. But as we would have said, we have November 25th coming up on Saturday, the beginning of our 16 days of activism. And as a part of that period, JFJ will be hosting a community intervention on December 8th at the Halfway Tree Transport Center, beginning at 1 p.m., ending at 5 p.m. And we will be out in our numbers, giving information, talking about JFJ's history, sharing our pamphlets. Our attorneys will be there. So if you have any complaints, if you need any sort of assistance, we will be on deck. We will also be joined by the Domestic Violence Intervention Center of the JCF for the day. And we have a little bit of a surprise, it's a walking thing where it's going to be excitement. We're going to have our posters. You're going to be out in our t-shirts, walking the streets of Halfway Tree. And we will be joined by the Tivoli Drum Corps marching band that will bring a little flair to our event. So come out, get your information, ask your questions. We will be there from 1 to 5 at the Halfway Tree Transport Center on December 8th. Of course, we have several things coming up over the period of the 16 days, so stay tuned to our social media, our Twitter, JA for Justice, and Instagram, JA for Justice. We will have information coming out in our social media graphics. We will be having a Right of the Day series that between myself and my producer, we'll be explaining some important provisions on our social medias over the next 16 days, as well as some other events that several persons would have been invited to coming up. So keep watching and engaging with our social medias. Now, I believe next week, or is it the week after, we will have on December 5th a special episode with CCJ President Justice Saunders. Now, we are going to be putting out a Vox Pop poster on our Instagram later on this week, but we're letting our loyal listeners know from before so they can prepare themselves. We will be asking for your opinions on the Caribbean Court of Justice, whether or not it should be implemented here as our final court of appeal, what if any reservations you have, if you have any questions. Now, of course, if you send us in a video message, you will be eligible to receive $500 credit from the network of your choice, and you would send that to our normal WhatsApp number for the show, which is 876-239-7583. Now, you don't have to send a video message, but we are encouraging it, and if you do send a message, you may be featured on that episode on December 5th. So think about your questions. We'll be posting our graphic later on this week. You can respond and let us know your thoughts on the Caribbean Court of Justice or any questions you may have for Justice Saunders when he joins us on the day. So we'll be back next week for Let's Talk Justice at the same time, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Unfortunately, Miss Jackson was not able to join me today, but we forgive her. She's busy doing the important background work that JFJ needs to get done. So we appreciate her sacrifice, and we look forward to her joining us next week as usual. I am Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice, and we'll see you again next week, 1 p.m.